Chapter 16, Miss Honey's Cottage. Miss Honey joined Matilda outside the school gates, and the two of them walked in silence through the village high street. They passed the green grocer with his window full of apples and oranges, and the butcher with bloody lumps of meat on display, and naked chickens hanging up, and the small bank and the grocery store and the electrical shop. And then they came out at the other side of the village up a narrow country road where there were no people anymore and very few motor cars. And now that they were alone, Matilda all of a sudden became wildly animated. It seemed as though a bulb had burst inside her and a great gush of energy was being released. She trotted beside Miss Honey with wild little hops, and her fingers flew as if she would scatter them to the four winds, and her words went off like fireworks with terrific speed. It was Miss Honey this and Miss Honey that, and Miss Honey, I do honestly feel like I could almost move anything in the world, not just tipping over glasses and little things like that. I feel like I could topple tables and chairs, Miss Honey. Even when people are sitting in chairs, I think I could push them over, and bigger things too, much bigger things than chairs and tables. I only have to take a moment to get my eye strong, and then I can push it out, the strongness at anything at all, so long as I am staring at it hard enough. I have to stare at it very hard, Miss Honey, very, very hard, and then I can feel it all happening behind my eyes, and my eyes get hot, just as though they were burning, but I don't mind that in the very least. And Miss Honey, calm yourself down, child, calm yourself down, Miss Honey said. Let's not get ourselves too worked up early in the proceedings. But don't you think it's interesting, don't you, Miss Honey? Oh, it's interesting, all right, Miss Honey said. It is more interesting, but we must tread very carefully from now on, Matilda. Why must we tread carefully, Miss Honey? Because we are playing with a mysterious force, my child, that we know nothing about. I do not think they are evil, but they may be good. They may be divine, but whether they are or not, let us handle them carefully. These were wise words from a wise old bird, but Matilda was too steamed up to see it that way. I don't see why we have to be careful, she said, still hopping about. I'm trying to explain to you, Miss Honey said patiently, that we are dealing with the unknown. It is an unexplainable thing. The right word for it is a phenomenon. Phenomenon. Am I that? Am I quite possibly that? Yes, I think so, Miss Honey said, but rather you didn't think about yourself as anything in particular at that moment. What I thought we might do is explore this strangeness a little further, just the two of us together, but making sure we take things very carefully all the time. You want me to do some more of it then, Miss Honey? That is what I'm tempted to suggest, Miss Honey said cautiously. Goody good, Matilda said. I myself, Miss Honey said, am probably far more than what you are and what you need, but I am trying to find some reasonable explanation. Such as what? Matilda asked. Such as whether or not it's got something to do with the fact that you're quite exceptionally precautious. What exactly does that mean? Matilda said. You are one that shows amazing intelligence early on. You are an unbelievably smart and intelligent child. Am I really? Matilda asked. Of course you are. You must be aware of that. Look at your reading. Look at your math. I suppose you're right, Matilda said. Miss Honey marveled at the child's lack of proudness and self-consciousness. I can't help wondering, she said, whether the sudden ability that has come to you of being able to move an object without touching it, whether it might have something to do with your brain power. You mean there might not be room in my head for all those brains, so something has to get pushed out? That's not quite what I mean, Miss Honey said, smiling, but whatever happens, and I can say it again, we must tread carefully now from now on. I have not forgotten that strange and distant glimmer on your face after you tipped over the last glass. Do you think it could actually hurt me? Is that what you're thinking, Miss Honey? It made you very strange, didn't it? It made me feel lovely, Matilda said. For a moment or two, I was flying past the stars on silver wings. I told you that, and shall I tell you something else, Miss Honey? It was easier the second time, much, much easier. I think it's like anything else. The more you practice it, the easier it gets. Miss Honey was walking slowly so that the small child could keep up with her without trotting too fast, and it was very peaceful out there on the narrow road, now that the village was behind them. It was one of those golden autumn afternoons, and there were blackberries and splashes of old man's beard in the hedges, and the hawthorn berries were ripening scarlet for the birds when the cold winter came along. There were tall trees here and there on either side, oak and sycamore and ash, and occasionally a sweet chestnut. Miss Honey, wishing to change the subject for a moment, gave the names of all these to Matilda and taught her how to recognize them by the shape of their leaves and the pattern of the bark on their trunks. Matilda took all this in and stored the knowledge away carefully in her mind. They came finally to a gap in the hedge on the left-hand side of the road where there was a 5-barred gate. "This way," Miss Honey said. She opened the gate and led Matilda through and closed it again. They were now walking through a narrow lane that was no more than a rutted cart track. There was a high hedge of hazel on either side, and you could see clusters of ripe brown nuts in their green jackets. The squirrels would be collecting them all very soon, Miss Honey said, and storing them away carefully for the bleak months ahead. "You mean you live down here?" Matilda asked. "I do," Miss Honey replied. But she said no more. Matilda had never once stopped to think about where Miss Honey might be living. She had always regarded her purely as a teacher, a person who turned up out of nowhere and taught at school and then went away again. Do any of us children, she wondered, ever stop to ask ourselves where our teachers go when they are over from a day of school? Do we wonder if they live alone or if there is a mother at home or a sister or husband? "Do you live all by yourself, Miss Honey?" she asked. "Yes," Miss Honey said, "very much so." They were walking over the deep sun-baked mud tracks of the lane, and you had to watch where you put your feet if you didn't want to twist your ankle. There were a few small birds around in the hazel branches, but that was all. "It's just a farm laborer's cottage," Miss Honey said. "You mustn't expect too much of it. We're nearly there." They came to a small green gate, half buried in the hedge on the right and almost hidden by the overhanging hazel branches. Miss Honey paused with one hand on the gate and said, "There it is. That's where I live." Matilda saw a narrow dirt path leading to a tiny red brick cottage. The cottage was so small it looked more like a doll's house than a human dwelling. The bricks it was built of were old and crumbly and very pale red. It had a gray slate roof and one small chimney. There were 2 little windows at the front. Each window was no larger than a sheet of tabloid newspaper, and there was clearly no upstairs to the place. On either side of the path there was a wilderness of nettles and blackberry thorns and long brown grasses, an enormous oak tree overshadowing the cottage. Its massive, spreading branches seemed to be unfolding and embracing the tiny building and perhaps hiding it as well from the rest of the world. Miss Honey, with one hand on the gate she had not yet opened, turned to Matilda and said, "A poet called Dylan Thomas once wrote some lines that I think of every time I walk up this path." Matilda waited, and Miss Honey, in a rather wonderful, slow voice, began reciting the poem. "Never and never my girl riding far and near, in the land of the hawthorn tales and spelled asleep. Fear believe that the wolf in the sheep white hood, looping and bleeding, roughly and blithely shall leap, my dear, out of the lair and the flocked leaves in the dew-dipped year, to eat your heart in the house in the rosy wood." There was a moment of silence, and Matilda, who had never before heard great romantic poetry spoken aloud, was profoundly moved. "It's like music," she whispered. "It is music," Miss Honey said. And then, as though embarrassed at having revealed such a secret part of herself, she quickly pushed open the gate and walked up the path. Matilda hung back. She was a little bit frightened of this place now. It seemed so unreal and remote and fantastic and so totally away from this earth. It was like an illustration in Grimm or Hans Andersen. It was a house where the poor woodcutter lived with Hansel and Gretel, and where Red Riding Hood's grandmother lived, and it was also the house of the 7 dwarfs and the 3 bears, and the rest of them. It was straight out of a fairy tale. "Come along, my dear," Miss Honey called back, and Matilda followed her up the path. The front door was covered with flaky green paint, and there was no keyhole. Miss Honey simply lifted the latch and pushed open the door and went in. Although she was not a tall woman, she had to stoop low to get through the doorway. Matilda went after her and found herself in what seemed to be a dark, narrow tunnel. "You can come through to the kitchen and help make me some tea," Miss Honey said, and she led the way along the tunnel into the kitchen. That is, if you could call it a kitchen. It was not much bigger than a good-sized closed cupboard. There was one small window in the back wall with a sink under the window, but there were no taps over the sink. Against another wall, there was a shelf, presumably for preparing food. There was a single cupboard above the shelf. On the shelf itself, there stood a Primus stove, a saucepan, and a half-full bottle of milk. A Primus is a little camping stove that you fill with paraffin and you light it at the top and then you pump it to get pressure from the flame. You can get me some water while I light the Primus, Miss Honey said. The well is out at the back. Take the bucket. Here it is. You'll find a rope in the well. Just hook the bucket on the end of the rope and lower it down, but don't fall in yourself. Matilda, she was more bemused than ever now, took the bucket and carried it to the back garden. The well had a little wooden roof over it and simply winding device, and there was a rope dangling down into the dark bottom hole. Matilda pulled up the rope and hooked up the handle of the bucket to the end of it. Then she lowered it until she heard a splash, and the rope went slack. She pulled it up again, and lo and behold, there was water in the bucket. Never, Matilda said. It's fun. How did you get enough water for your baths? I don't take a bath, Miss Honey said. I wash standing up. I get a bucket full of water, and I heat it over this little stove, and I wash myself all over. Do you honestly do that? Matilda asked. Of course I do, Miss Honey said. Every poor person in England used to wash that way until not very long ago, and they didn't even have a Primus. They had to heat the water over the fire in the hearth. Are you poor, Miss Honey? Yes, Miss Honey said, very. It's a good little stove, isn't it? The Primus was roaring away with a powerful blue flame, and already the water in the saucepan was beginning to bubble. Miss Honey got a teapot from the cupboard and put some tea leaves into it. She also found half a small loaf of brown bread. She cut 2 thin slices, and then from a plastic container, she took some margarine and spread it out on the bread. Margarine, Matilda thought. She really must be poor. Miss Honey found a tray, and on it she put 2 mugs, the teapot, the half bottle of milk, and a plate with 2 slices of bread. I'm afraid I don't have any sugar, she said. I never use it. That's all right, Matilda said. In her wisdom, she seemed to be aware of the delicacy of the situation. She was taking great care not to say anything to embarrass her companion.